Radio Espial is a series of podcasts brought to you across the internet by TIPM Media. Presented by investigative journalist Mick Rooney, it covers a host of topics from international media, publishing, aviation, and technology. Thank you for listening to this podcast today.
Welcome again to Radio Espial. This is episode 10. Another great guest lined up for you. Let's take it away. The subject tonight is going to be missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370. This is a subject that we've covered a number of times. We have a great guest lined up for you. I'll tell you about that shortly. You're very welcome.
We explore and discover together.
Thank you for joining us for episode 10. We're talking missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370. I'm going to tell you about our guest very shortly. Just a quick brief info about Radio Espial. We're a global internet broadcast with audio and video. Our focus is on the media, how it deals with related news matters. Our core areas are publishing, writing, aviation, technology, and we consider other things as well. You can find us on the internet on www.radioespial.com. You can find this episode and previous episodes that we've done on podcast and videocast through iTunes, Spreaker, SoundCloud, YouTube, and many other channels. Now, let's get straight to our guest this evening. And well, first of all, we'll deal with the topic. Just to give you, we've discussed this topic quite a number of times on previous episodes. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 was a scheduled international passenger flight which disappeared on the 8th of March 2014 while flying from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, Malaysia to Beijing Capital International Airport in China. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER operated by Malaysia Airlines. It last made air traffic control contact over the South China Sea shortly before entering Vietnam airspace, and that was about 40 minutes after takeoff. Malaysia military radar continued to track the aircraft for a period of time after it deviated westwards back over the Malaysia Peninsula. It left the range of military radar approximately around the time of about 2:22 a.m. Northwest of Penang. The aircraft was carrying 12 Malaysia crew members and 227 passengers from 15 nations. There was an initial multinational search effort for the aircraft. It remains the largest and most expensive search in aviation history. The search began in the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand and on to the southern Indian Ocean. More than 4 years later, its final resting place has never been located. This has prompted many theories about its disappearance, from the possible to the plausible to the bizarre and the ridiculous. Now, there have been two primary searches for the remains of the seabed wreckage of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 over the past 4 years. One was conducted by Fuguru Worldwide and the ATS, the Australian Transport Safety Board, and there's been a more recent one which is just concluded, and that was conducted under contract by a company called Ocean Infinity and the Malaysian government. Okay, it's time to move now to my guest tonight to discuss quite a number of topics surrounding this whole case. Juanda Ismail is a professional pilot currently flying for an airline in the United States. His flying experience is quite diverse, having flown in many places around the world, including the airspaces of Australia, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand and Singapore in the past. He's currently based in Los Angeles, where he flies to over 100 destinations in the USA, from the west coast of the United States to the east coast and into neighbouring Canada as well as Mexico. Having spent 12 years flying professionally, over twice as many as a private pilot, he has a good understanding of the operational capabilities of air traffic control procedures and services in the regions he has flown. His professional flying experience is diverse, with a grand total of over 4,700 hours, over 2,400 hours of that as an airline pilot, and 1,800 hours as a flight instructor. His background is equally as diverse as his flying experience, having been born in Singapore, of Malaysia and Singaporean parentage. At the age of 5, he migrated to Australia, where he grew up and lived most of his life, until the last 12 years, where he has lived and worked as an expat pilot living in China, Indonesia and the United States. He speaks fluent Bahasa Indonesia and Malaysia, as well as conversational Thai and Burmese languages. He also holds a science degree in biochemistry and has worked in the educational field as a high school science teacher. But his passion and his interest in aviation has seen him pursue his hobby and made it into a career later in his life. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's now time to go and talk to Juanda. Okay, you're back on Radio Espial. Juanda Ismail joins us. Juanda, you're very welcome.
Oh, thank you, Mick. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here talking to you today.
Yeah, and like I say, with a lot of my guests on the program, wherever you're watching or listening to this, usually most of my guests are people that I've got to know over the period of time. I think you and I probably have got to know each other better over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think we've been friends a while on Facebook and through other media. Yeah.
Okay, obviously the topic today is missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370. We've done previous programs on this topic. I think this is about a third or fourth program on it, and it certainly won't be the last. It certainly won't be the last now. So I'm not going to go over a long introductories in. People can check out the previous programs if they want the full background to this story. What really we're going to talk about today is the more ins and outs and where specifically we are now with this horrible tragedy. Juanda, like all our guests, I like to start with perhaps just our guests giving a little bit of a flavour of who you are, what you're about, some of your background, and maybe just starting with your early life. You grew up in, was it Singapore?
Yeah, I was born in Singapore. I lived there for 5 years before my family migrated to Australia. So from the age of 5, I grew up in Australia, went to school there, went to college, university there. I learned to fly in Australia after I finished college. So yeah, pretty much you can consider me as an Australian, I guess, because that's where I've lived most of my life. Except for the last 12 years where I've been pretty much being on the go, going to where the jobs are as a professional pilot. So for the last 12 years, I've been living in places like China and Indonesia, and in the last year and a half, I've been here in the US. So yeah, I grew up in Australia, and currently, all over the place, just living out of a suitcase basically for the last 10 or 12 years.
I talked a couple of times. We've had James Nixon on, and he was James, of course, is now a retired captain, but he did say sometimes the lifestyle is not quite so glamorous, and it does wear you down because you're sleeping at various different times depending on what flight you're servicing.
Yes, that's right. Right now I'm in a hotel in St. Louis, and I have a 24-hour overnight here, and tomorrow night's going to be a different place altogether, and that's pretty much the way it's been.
That's the way it is.
Yes, that's right.
So just what was it that clicked and got you into aviation? Where did the bug, as it were, grip you?
Yeah, okay. Because in my younger years, we did a lot of travel. Back in the 70s, we lived in Australia, and we used to go to Singapore quite a lot for holidays to visit our family back there. And back in those days, you could go up and visit the cockpit. This is well before 9/11, of course.
And cockpit
and
security,
I made many cockpit visits on my flights back home to Singapore. And every time I visited the cockpit, I talked to the pilots, and I looked at all the instruments and the dials in the cockpit, and that really inspired me to become a pilot.
That's what I want to do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So ever since I was about 5-6 years old, I've been wanting to become a pilot. And it wasn't until after I finished my university degree that I picked up a private pilot's license, and I did that for quite a lot. I did that for probably about 10 to 15 years, and worked as a school teacher in the meantime to finance that, because it's not cheap.
Nope.
And then after that, I decided, okay, I'm going to do what I've really wanted to do in my life, and that is to become an airline pilot. So I pursued that career later in life. So I started off as being a school teacher, and then a change in career, and now I'm doing what I really love to do, and that's to fly.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We're going to shortly talk a little bit about the second search, the search carried out by Ocean Infinity. But just before that, I suppose the logical question I want to ask you is that I suppose this whole tragic case has been going now for 4 years, but let's just briefly, without getting into too much detail, whereabouts were you, and can you specifically remember when you heard about this? I would imagine probably from the news wires you first heard of this. We're going back obviously to the morning of March the 8th, 2014. So just how did it unfold from your perspective?
Okay, yeah, I remember that day very well, Mick. I was in Indonesia. I was flying for one of the local airlines there, the government domestic airline at the time. And I was asleep, and I got a message from a friend of mine saying that Malaysian Airlines has gone missing. And immediately I went onto the internet, and as most pilots do, we log on to the internet and we have a look at that website EP10, because pretty much there's lots of rumours that goes posted on that website EP10. So I was trying to find out if anyone had any other information about the plane and what was happening. And of course, back in those early days, there was lots of rumours about what was happening. There was some posts that mentioned that the plane actually landed in China, of all places. I remember that. And I'm thinking, okay, they've just done a diversion, and that might have meant that there might have been some problem on board.
No, I think that was all our initial thoughts. That look, it's fine. It's just some form of serious communication problem they're having, and they'll just divert and land. And
that's right.
The hours passed by, and it didn't quite turn out that way. That's right.
Yeah, and then I heard of a search that was going on in the southern China Sea, and there were rumours of debris being located by aircraft that were flying that route. And my first thought was, that might have been an accident, and they might have ended up in the South China Sea. But as the day progressed, and as the weeks progressed, then that became more of a mystery, because they then thought that the plane headed in an entirely different direction. And when they said that the plane might be in the southern Indian Ocean, and that was really mind-blowing, because that was way off course. And then there was rumours about debris being located around there as well in the southern Indian Ocean, and I thought, it won't be long before they start retrieving the black boxes and so forth. But as the days progressed and nothing was found, then that made it really surprising and intriguing for me anyway, about the whole mystery of Malaysian 370. So yeah, that's pretty much how it unfolded to me.
I know that you've put forward, we'll call it a supposition as to what might have been happening to the aircraft after its last known communication at waypoint to Gary. We'll talk about that in just a second. But just before we do that, and where we really start to get into the nitty-gritty, just on Ocean Infinity and the second search, and just if people are following this, and this is the first sort of news update they've had in a while, that search has now formally concluded, and the vessel has already left the search area in the southern Indian Ocean. Just your thoughts then on the second search.
I was quite hopeful that they might have picked up something during the second search, because the indications were that with the drift modelling and with the other analysis that's been going on, I think there was a higher
expectation.
That's right. Yeah, that something would be found. So something not found. Well, they haven't found anything. That's a bit of a disappointment, of course. But I hope that they will continue in the next summer, searching along the seventh arc, or even well north of that.
It's just people are wondering, well, why don't they just go back to port and start again? Just to clarify for people, Ocean Infinity were contracted by initially the company Ocean Infinity back in, I think it was March of last year, 2017, actually approached the Malaysian government and said, look, the previous Fugro-led search is finished. We believe we've got better technology, and we can search just as large an area quite quickly. It seemed to take quite a long time for the Malaysian government to, put out tenders, look at other companies, but ultimately in December, they announced that they were going to let this independent company, Ocean Infinity, go ahead and search, and so that's what's been happening since January of this year. And the designated areas, which were all north of the previous larger search zone, have essentially been searched now. Unfortunately, we've had no success. So that's just sort of the background. But obviously we're all disappointed. I suppose when we talk about the second search, and we're going to lead into now some of what maybe happened to that aircraft early on in its flight. But just on, I suppose the natural question and maybe reaction that everybody has now, beyond just the disappointment of that, okay, it still hasn't been found, is, have we got something wrong? Have we assumed something we shouldn't have assumed? Is the data, the Inmarsat data, not quite what we thought it was reliable as what can affect, just your thoughts around that, because people will immediately and understandably say they must have got something's wrong here if they've searched all this area and still can't find it. Is it just because it's not there, it's somewhere else?
Yeah, well, I think the search area was based on a few assumptions, and one of the assumptions were that the airplane was on automatic pilot, and it was flown in, I think, they made the assumption that it was flown on one of 5 different modes of autopilot. From what my understanding was that it could have been in automatic pilot mode, in heading mode, or in track mode, or using the flight management computer's LNAV mode. And
it's important because people will say, oh, okay, fine, but then can't they work all that out? But it's important to, with the different modes that the aircraft can be set to, it's important to say even only a slight change can have such a significant impact on the final area.
Absolutely,
small little things like that. We have to understand that the southern Indian Ocean is a vast ocean, and not the most hospitable ocean at the best of times.
Yeah, I think the turn back from Igari and thereafter to Penang and west of Penang tells us a lot about what may have happened towards the end of the flight, Mick, because
it doesn't quite look like that part of the flight. That there's some indications in it. It's like when I know people will look at things like flight radar, and they'll understand that the planes generally, they don't fly exactly in straight lines, but predominantly an aircraft in cruise mode, on a map, when you're tracking it looks reasonably straight and steady. There were some indications on the work that Mike Exner and Victor Anello have done that there appears to be slight wavering, that aircraft may not necessarily have been in autopilot, that it is possible it was being what we call hand flown, manually flown.
I'm very confident that is the case, because when it was turning back from Igari, actually I first picked this up when I looked at the factual information report back in 2015, because if you have a look at the track from departure to Igari, I mean, that track is as straight as a die.
Straight as an arrow, yep.
That's right. That's what you expect a track to look like when it's on automatic pilot mode. That is most probably on LNAV, in the FMC LNAV mode that the plane was tracking on to get to Igari. Now, if you have a look at the track coming back from Igari, it's like a snake. It's not straight. It seems like there were
undulations in it. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I was a flight instructor, and I used to have students in the simulator, and I get them to hand fly. And when I have a look at their track, when they're hand flying the aircraft, and comparing that when the automatic pilot is on, then obviously they're not going to be as straight as the autopilot when the autopilot's engaged, when they're tracking.
And consequently, that's why airlines and professional pilots themselves, as often as possible, have the aircraft engaged in an autopilot mode, because that is actually the safest and steadiest way and most efficient way to fly.
Yes, that's right, absolutely, yeah. And especially flying at high altitude as well, where the air is less dense, it's a lot harder to keep the airplane straight and level at those altitudes. So it would make more sense for a pilot to have the autopilot on when they're flying at 35,000 feet or anywhere around that altitude. So if you have a look at the track coming back from Igari towards Penang, then that track had quite a few different course changes in short periods of time, mm-hmm. and that would suggest that the plane was being hand flown, because when you have the autopilot on, of course you're going to be flying a much straighter track than that.
I suppose I'm sure people listening to us want me to ask this question. I feel it's important to ask. Mm-hmm. Can we maybe examine, is there any reason why the aircraft would not be in autopilot mode flying, after it's turned from Igari? Can we quantify any reasons of what might have been going on?
Okay. There could be a number of reasons, and I think the main reason would be that it wasn't possible to fly in mm-hmm. autopilot mode, and the autopilot will disengage when the aircraft is not receiving accurate data from its flight computers, for example. And there are instances when the autopilot will just kick off because the aircraft is unstable. The aircraft is not within the limitations of what the autopilot can do in terms of keeping it straight and level. So the autopilot will kick off and say, okay, it's out of my control now. You got to hand fly this. That's right. Yeah. That might be one possibility, and that's happened a few times as well. Secondly, it could be deliberately done. The autopilot can be deliberately disengaged because
switch off,
because the pilot wants to take full control of the aircraft. It might have entered into a state where it was unstable. So you kick off the autopilot and you hand fly it. And it also could be due to the fact that the aircraft might have experienced a malfunction of some sort. So in those instances, then you turn off the autopilot and you fly the aircraft manually. And if you wanted to turn back as quickly as you could, then that would probably be the quickest way of doing it. You turn off the autopilot, you hand fly it back, and from there, once you've got the aircraft stabilized in the direction that you want it to fly to, then you would then try to re-engage the autopilot if you could. There are some...
You posed the question, going back to your study of this particular part of the flight, and I suppose posited the question, is it possible that this aircraft was attempting some form of diversion and was essentially lining itself up to attempt at least to land at Penang?
From what I've investigated, Mick, it looks very much like it. It was trying to get back to Penang. If you have a look at the standard arrival into Penang, there's one called the BIDMO 1 Alpha arrival procedure. Standard arrival procedures are procedures which pilots follow when they want to land in a particular airport. So the arrival procedure will have the waypoints that they track to, and they'll also have the altitudes and the speeds as well that the air traffic controllers would like the plane to descend at and follow. If you have a look at the BIDMO 1 Alpha arrival, I've got the waypoints here on my website if anyone wants to have a look at it.
We'll share your website and links in the wherever people see this podcast and videocast, so they'll be able to access them.
Yeah. All right. We've got arrival points on that arrival called Bidmo, Puka, and Endor. If you have a look at the track, it tracks quite closely to Bidmo, and then Puka, and it actually tracks directly over one of the points called Endor. And when I say directly over, I mean directly over.
Directly. It is absolutely directly over.
That's right. And then from Endor, it goes to a point south of Penang, about 7 miles from the runway south of Penang. Now, if you were to map that and cross-reference that with the standard arrival procedure, as well as the instrument approach, the ILS instrument approach landing chart for Penang, for runway 04 for the ILS, then there is actually a point on that chart where you can do what we call a course reversal procedure to allow the plane to intercept the ILS, intercept the course.
Essentially turn around and try and intercept the ILS beam.
That's right, yeah. And that point is a point 7 miles south of the runway. And MH370 flew exactly over that particular point. Now, if you have a look at the ILS chart, when you fly over that point, you are then required to fly on a track of 267 degrees. And that will allow you to make a 180-degree turn to intercept the final course for the ILS for runway 04. Now, looking at the tracking from the primary radar, after it passed that point, 7 degrees south of the runway, it actually did turn and track 267 degrees. So it was pretty much exactly as per the instrument approach chart for the ILS for runway 04. Now, so we have three indications there that the aircraft was following the Bidmo 1 arrival and the ILS. If you say that all that was a coincidence, then
it's a lot of coincidences.
That's right, yeah. And we're talking about almost perfect tracks at what you would expect an aircraft to fly if it was trying to land at Penang. Now, the problem, of course, was that all indications are that the aircraft was still at a high altitude because the speed was quite high. And to get the speeds that we see on the primary radar, then the aircraft would still have to be at quite a reasonably high altitude. And there could be reasons for that.
Yeah, because again, I'll ask the obvious question, and I'm sure people are in their heads, asking, okay, so if they're not all coincidences, and yes, there was some intention to try and land there, then the question then is, why did the aircraft remain at such a height? And there's some suggestions from that track and the primary surveillance radar that this aircraft may at times have been pushed to its absolute altitude ceiling, and I think that's something in the region of 43,000 feet, which is right at the operational safe manual.
Yeah, could be a number of reasons, and if you've ever done any flying in a simulator, for example, and you practice emergency scenarios in the simulator, you know that you're going to be very busy in the simulator trying to do everything. If this was an emergency, they tried to get back to Penang as quick as they could, and there may have been lots of things happening in the cockpit at the time, and plus the fact that you're flying the plane manually. Now, it's very hard, I guess, for us to try and envisage what may have happened at that particular point. But you're busy. You're flying. You're hand flying the plane. You might have thought that the plane would respond normally to what you expect it to do. For example, if you wanted to make a descent, you'll set the altitude selector to a lower altitude. You might think that the autopilot may still function, and then you go ahead and try and do something that you've been used to doing in the past, and it doesn't respond, and then yet there might be some other distraction that's happening. Then if you thought that the plane was descending when it wasn't, but there were other things going on in the cockpit, then that plane might have just kept on at its particular altitude and not have done anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I suppose my follow-up question, and again, it's another question that I have to ask, as uncomfortable as some questions can be.
Yeah.
As a flight instructor, when you look at that track, does that track strike you as a track flown by somebody who has little or no experience of flying an aircraft?
Absolutely not. No, that shows a lot of experience.
Okay.
I mean, if you were to track to a particular point and to manually fly that point, and to get to that point, I'm talking about that point indoor, by the way, then that would take a lot of skill to do. To fly a plane, hand fly a plane, especially at altitude, because if you're hand flying a plane at high altitude, then the air being less dense, it's not as easy as what it is when you're flying at a lower altitude. So that would take a lot of skill to do. What we
do know at that point is there was, I suppose, what we would call the second most significant turn of the aircraft. It then turns northwest, am I right? Yeah, northwest.
Yeah.
And essentially starts taking a path up through towards the Andaman Sea, the Malacca, what's called the Malacca Strait. So just your thoughts there, where are we going? We know where the aircraft went generally, but your thoughts on, again, what might have been happening there. So let's assume there's some attempt for some reason to try and get the aircraft landed at Penang. That hasn't happened for whatever reason, whether it's incapacitation or whatever's going on in that cockpit, but it doesn't happen. And now we've got another major turn, and now we're moving up the Malacca Strait.
All right. Okay. Yeah. After that turn, there was a turn to a heading of about 267, and then from there, I think it goes on to a track of about 300 or 310, basically on a northwesterly heading. Once again, if you were to look at the finer points and look at the tracks in detail, you'll find that over a period of about 35 nautical miles, there was something like 38 different course changes as it was heading up the Malacca Strait. Now, once again, that would indicate that the plane was not on automatic pilot, because that's not the profile that you would expect of an aircraft that's flying on autopilot.
Essentially, waypoint to waypoint, yeah.
Yeah. So those track changes, in my opinion, could mean that the plane was either being controlled manually by someone flying the plane in an abrupt way, with no real idea of where they were.
What their final intention was, yeah. That's
right, or where they were going. It could also mean that no one was in control of the plane, because if you have a look at the tracking, it seemed as if the plane was just meandering up the Malacca Strait.
Yeah,
and if that was the case.
But I think what I'd like to establish is then that we know that the turn of the Gary, it wasn't just the aircraft just decided of its own accord that had to be an intended action.
Yeah.
We seem pretty much agreed that the after it passed over Penang out towards the sea, and the next turn also appeared to be a specific action to go in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. That turn of the 267, for me anyway, that seems to be a deliberate turn. But thereafter, if you have a look at the tracking, then it seems to be like the plane was meandering. And if you go through the thought processes of the ATSB, for example, the ghost flight scenario, where there may have been pilot incapacitation, then in my opinion, that was probably where it started to happen. The pilot incapacitation started to happen, where after the turn to 267 and then further to 300 or 310, then to have something like 38 course changes within 35 nautical miles is not an aircraft that was under control.
Okay, let's I suppose move on to the next logical step. There's essentially where we believe the aircraft is now. There's essentially one final last turn of significance.
Right.
I think this is where we're off the coast of is it Sumatra or my Indonesia? Yeah, we're sort of we're well up north there. So again, your thoughts how it's going essentially in the 267 heading, and all of a sudden it's no longer doing that, and now it's if we're looking at that process of significant incapacitation, how do we get to that last final turn south into the South Indian Ocean?
Okay, well, who's to say that there weren't more minor turns before that major turn?
Yeah.
There could have been many small changes of direction leading to a turn to the south, or a correction to the south. As I understand it, Mick, the reason why we think that the plane was heading in the southerly direction is through the BFO data that Inmarsat
that's the burst timing offset, in the Inmarsat data that's embedded in that data. Yeah, and the BFO, I think it was at the time 1840. I think that was the BFO data at 1840 indicated that a turn to the south may have happened, on the assumption that the aircraft maintained a constant altitude. Now, if the autopilot was disconnected and the plane is not under any control, then it's unlikely that the plane could have maintained a constant altitude. Now, if that's the case, then that argument of the BFO data suggesting that the plane turned to the south then becomes questionable. Now, I've been talking to one or two people about this, and another person suggested that for the BFO data to read what was reading at that particular time, there could be two interpretations. One could be a turn to the south, or the other interpretation could be that the plane continued on that particular heading or that particular course, but descended at a rate of around about 2,500 feet per minute. Now, that's interesting, because if that was the case, then that would put the plane in the area where there was a sighting made by a person that was on a yacht in the Andaman Sea, around that region. That's right,
about the time where you would expect MH370 to be. So that's another thing that I think could be investigated further.
Okay, on that part of the analysis, let's just park that first. We're going to come back to it, but let's just we're at the sailor in the sea who spots potentially an aircraft behaving oddly and turning sort of, I think initially was going slightly west and then went completely south. I just want to move. We've been told by the new minister, Anthony Loke, the transport minister in Malaysia, that we are now going to have a final report, and just very quickly for people who go, what's a final essentially, and this is like no aircraft investigation I think any of us in our lifetimes have ever experienced, but just generally when an aircraft investigation reaches its concluding points, essentially all the information is gathered, and normally we have wreckage, the aircraft's recovered, examined, all the scenarios are gone through, and the eureka point, this is what we think happened, this is what we've looked at the voice recorder, the flight data recorder, and essentially at the end of an investigation, the Annex 13 safety team, which is kind of like the investigation, what the investigation team is called, produce this final report. However, we're in we're in strange times because we essentially have the promise of a final report in July, I believe, or potentially before July or sometime in July. But we don't have an aircraft.
That's right, yeah. I think that's well premature to have a final report before...
It's generally what happens if an investigator, and it can, we've saw it with TWA 800, we've seen it with other aircraft, and that the nature of them are that they're not just done, in a few weeks or a few months, even when, an aircraft is recovered or wherever the site of the aircraft is. These things, even in a short investigation, often will take a year to 2 years fully, and investigations have been known to go for 10 years, 12 years. Obviously the next of kin, the families, are not too pleased about the fact that we have a final report, because final means final to them, that somehow the shop doors are being shut and the shutters pulled down, and that's it. There's nothing more we can do here.
Yeah, I think it's way too early to have a final report, because we don't know what happened to the plane, and I don't think you can make any conclusion at this stage as to what has happened to MH370. I would suggest to the minister that we hold off coming up with the final report until we know a little bit more about what may have happened to MH370. And I encourage the families, the next of kin, to approach the minister and ask him to stop with the production of the final report, because we simply don't know enough about what has happened. When I look at an air accident final report and I go through it, and I'd like to try and learn something from the particular accident. Now, we don't know enough about what has happened, so I don't think anyone can come to any conclusion and can learn from this at this stage of the investigation anyway.
Yeah, I'm my own thoughts on that are I'm not sure what additional things we're going to get in the final report that's somehow going to suggest that, okay, well, maybe this was appropriate, or I think you've answered the question really. We're both not expecting too much more in this final report, because it's kind of like, well, what extra is there? We know there's a dual criminal investigation. We haven't formally seen details of that report other than basic summaries that were included in an early interim report, but essentially we haven't, although we do have access to that criminal report, but it's never been officially released.
Right. Yeah.
There are certainly, I think we can agree, there are certainly things we'd like to see in the final report whenever it happens, and we I think we're both agreed it's way too early. There should be a top to bottom complete review of this over the next 6 months, and then consideration given to either do we search again, or okay, next March we need to release a final report. But that's when every stone is turned over and checked.
Yeah.
We know there are things that we'd like to see in a final report. Talk to us maybe about some of those things you'd like to see that we haven't already seen, that might exist but we haven't seen. And we've, over recent weeks, the pair of us privately have been looking at, for example, the flight manifest. Yeah,
that's right. There's a bit of a mystery there in terms of what's actually on the manifest. I think we were looking at the lithium batteries, for example, that was carried on board.
Yeah, this is a consignment. I think it was a Motorola consignment of what was marked down initially as lithium-ion batteries, and then chargers was also listed. And we don't know a great deal about that consignment. We've kind of just got the bare front bones of the airway manifest bill, but we don't have the backup information that we seem to have with the other consignments that were on board that aircraft.
That's right, yeah. That's a bit of a mystery as to why that part of the information was not included The other consignments had detailed information about what was carried, but the lithium batteries didn't. And that is a little bit suspicious to me. I mean, why would they leave that out? And as we saw from the official government website, where they list all of the items that were carried on the manifest, the cargo manifest, the lithium batteries had something like 26 pages, I think it was, that should have been there, that weren't there. And that is something that needs to be addressed. So why was that left out? Is there something there that they don't want us to see? That's something that we need to ask, and that's hopefully it's something that will come out in the final report as well.
And I think for me as well, one of the other areas that when I first came out, I came across these reports not actually that long ago, and I honestly wasn't aware of them. And I thought I'd been down every rabbit hole in this, but I was amazed to when somebody sent me these documents. These are documents around a sort of a committee meeting of ICAO. This is the international aviation body that sort of regulates and controls airlines throughout the world, and sets down principles as to how investigations need to work, and what's required, and responsibility, and so forth. I hadn't been aware that there was a meeting in January 2015, and there were some conclusions made. I'm not going to go into full details of them, but broadly I will simply say that the conclusions of ICAO back in January 2015 were pretty scathing of the initial part of the investigation, particularly the whole SAR operation. In fact, so much so that they immediately wanted improvements in the Asian region as to how events like this, specifically if an aircraft goes missing, and how it's actually dealt with, because they were none too impressed with the manner that this was dealt with in the initial stages.
Right, yeah.
So I'd certainly like to see the conclusions of the Annex 13 safety team onto, as perhaps now, what is it that they've fixed or addressed about those conclusions?
Yeah. I was a bit worried. I was a bit amazed as to the initial reactions of what happened when they discovered that MH370 didn't check on with Ho Chi Minh City ATC, because what should have happened after that was that within 5 minutes of not checking on, they should have started the first phase in the trying to locate the aircraft, and that wasn't undertaken. So there's some improvements that need to be done in that respect. I think it wasn't until something like 5 hours later
I think it was nearly 5:30 in the morning before formally somebody declared.
That's right.
That yes, we are now in SAR operation, search and recover.
Yeah, that's right. That was quite disappointing that it took so long for that to happen.
And really, in those circumstances, you set yourself so much on the back foot in a search, because we all say an aircraft can actually get quite a distance in 15, and we often talk about regulations and how often should aircraft be tracked and report in their exact positioning, but even in 15 minutes, an aircraft can go a hell of a long way, let alone 4 hours.
That's right, yeah. So yeah, I don't know whether it's misunderstanding on the air traffic controllers side, because where MH370 went missing was at a point where it was being transferred across from one flight information region to the other.
Yeah,
and I
from
think
Kuala Lumpur to Vietnam or Ho Chi Minh.
Yeah, and whether one thought that the other had initiated the search and rescue processes, or whether the other one, the other FIR, had initiated it or not. But then again, I mean, that's something that should have been cleared up very early on. It shouldn't have taken 5 hours to do something like that.
And we also, during those hours, we also had all sorts of misinformation communicated back and forth. I think at one stage, the Malaysia Airlines operational base was contacted, and somebody, not deliberately, obviously inadvertently, gave information that was perceived that the aircraft was actually flying in somewhere in Cambodia, and it was all things were fine until the aircraft communicated back, and that sent everybody off in one direction, trying to find out was that information correct, and then finding out that no, actually, sorry, somebody made a mistake. That was the projected tracker, or that wasn't actually where it is. We don't know where it is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I can understand there being miscommunication in that respect. But flight dispatchers, for example, should know where their aircraft is at any point in time. And if they can't locate where their aircraft is, then that's a real big problem in the whole operational side of things.
We touched on. Let's go back to our sailor in the ocean spotting. Potentially what she doesn't know. Other than she believed it was an aircraft. Obviously, she couldn't identify what aircraft it is, but it does seem to suggest indicators of what we now know, that there's a strong likelihood that it could possibly have been. But just in a wider area, as we move to start maybe talking about the debris, but just before then, to talk about eyewitnesses. We've an awful lot of eyewitnesses, and I'm not suggesting in any way that the Australian Transport Safety Board, the ATSB, and the investigation team in Malaysia haven't looked at these eyewitness reports, because I always have to remind people on groups, look, whether you like it or not, technical and criminal investigations work on a need-to-know basis. If you don't need to know, you don't get told. So we don't know to what extent the Australians and the Malaysians looked at all these eyewitness reports. And as I say to people as well, we've got so many eyewitness reports all over the place. They can't all be right. Not everybody could see it. And sometimes I think people look at them and then start trying to string them all. I've even seen people come up with crazy theories to somehow talk about some sighting in Sumatra, some sighting in the Malacca Strait, some sighting off Australia, and somehow try to link in a crazy way all these sightings up that are bonkers, like the timings are just completely off. But just talk to me a little bit about the eyewitness reports we have, and maybe specifically from that point that we were talking about with the lady sailor.
Okay, I think the sighting from the just north of Sumatra by the lady, the sailor, fits pretty well with the timing of where you would expect MH370 to be once it had left the Malacca Strait. I think initially we all assumed that the aircraft was at 35,000 feet or thereabouts. And if that was the case, then that would make it very difficult for the sighting of the sailor to be reconciled, because I think she was saying that she could see the lights of the cockpit being brightly lit.
Yeah, I don't think in any way. Look, we've all. I don't live far from an airport. I've been covering aviation for years. When a plane flies out of Schiphol Airport, I can generally estimate roughly within 1,000 feet or two, what flight level it's on, and I know the difference between an aircraft that's at 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, and 35,000, 40,000 feet, and there's a hell of a difference in what you can see and what you can't see. And then we've other sorts of things that you've got to factor in, conditions. You're at sea, you're in a boat that's moving itself. You're looking across the sea, you're at horizon lines, line of sights, everything like that. And of course, night, daytime, everything's got to be factored in.
That's right. If the plane was at 35,000 feet, then I would have thought that, that might have been something else that sailor saw. But when you look back at the analysis that I just did with the aircraft leaving Penang, and the possibility that the aircraft wasn't on automatic pilot, and the fact that when you're not on automatic pilot, it's unlikely that the plane will be continuously at a particular flight level. It could have been on a descent. There was enough time from when it left Penang at about 36,000 feet for it to do a descent at 2,500 feet per minute and be at an altitude that could have been observed by the sailor in the northern part of Sumatra. And if you have a look at the times, the timing could also fit in with the sighting at that particular location as well. So for me, of all of the observations, all of the possible sightings, then that one would be one that I would have a lot of confidence in believing.
I'm not going to mention his name because the man has been through the mill and he literally, I'm not even going to mention, but he was an oil rig worker who also claimed that he spotted or he believed that he might have possibly spotted the aircraft on the night. There's quite strong question marks that between line of sight and the distance he was away, that it seems unlikely, because this was a time quite close to when the aircraft had turned at Agari, and it seems quite a stretch to suggest that he could have seen the aircraft, and if he did, then we're all wrong. That the aircraft not only did it not turn back over Malaysia, but it must have went in the complete opposite direction, east, over to the oil rig.
That's right. Yeah.
We've also had, and the one thing I've promised myself this year, and people from groups MH370 groups will probably be familiar with me, but the one thing I promised myself this year, that I'd try and be as open-minded as possible. But even I there's only so far I can go, and I will not go to the ridiculous. However, we have, I think it's up to 19 people in the Maldives Islands that claim on the morning. Now, when we say morning, we're sort of talking, I think it was maybe sometime around 6:30 a.m. Claim that they saw an unusual, large, low-flying, what they refer to as a jumbo jet.
Right.
Look, I'll ask the question. What are your thoughts? And is there any scenario feasible that the aircraft after Penang could simply have continued going west towards the Maldives Islands? I think you've sent me fuel analysis, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think back then you said there is a model that might just about work to get it there, but she wasn't going pretty much anywhere else after that.
That's right, yeah. The thing though with the Maldives sighting is that if it did go there, then the Inmarsat data has to be incorrect, because obviously the Inmarsat data is having the aircraft track in a completely different direction. Yeah. And for a particular time that the aircraft in the Maldives would not have had enough. Sorry, I'll say that again. If you believe in the Inmarsat data, the plane would have crashed at about 0019, I think, UTC. Now, according to my fuel analysis, and
we're an hour out, aren't we? Really, with
that's right.
Not only in the fuel analysis, but we're an hour out with the witness times, or thereabouts, between 45 minutes and 60 minutes. We're out. That essentially what we're saying is the only feasible fuel model that could get the aircraft over the Maldives at the time was when it was virtually close to fuel exhaustion. But the problem is, it was roughly an hour before any of these witnesses claimed to have seen a low-flying aircraft.
That's right, yeah. Well, a 6:15 Maldives time is about, I think there's a 3-hour time difference between Maldives and Malaysia. And by that time, if you were to look at the Inmarsat data, the plane would have ran out of fuel. But I did a fuel analysis based on a power setting that was at the holding configuration for the aircraft. And if you have a look at the fuel analysis based on that assumption, then the aircraft could have continued on and flown until, I think it was like 6:25 or something like that, Maldives time. Now, if they said that they saw something at about 6:15, then the aircraft then could have gone on for another 10 minutes after their sighting. So if you discounted the Inmarsat data and based on the fuel analysis that I did with the aircraft at that particular flight configuration of the aircraft being using a configuration that allowed it to hold, then the aircraft could have flown up until about 6:25, I think it was, Maldives time. So that sort of like fits in with the time that the sightings were made, with 10 minutes after, and then there would have been completely fuel exhaustion after that. But once again, that doesn't reconcile with Inmarsat data. So you either believe people in the Maldives.
I think the words of, and we'll talk shortly about Blaine Allen Gibson, because I want to talk a little bit about the debris and the significance of the debris. I think Blaine summed it up as perfectly, I think, and simply as anybody. With no disrespect to Inmarsat, no disrespect to the fishermen in the Maldives who and other people who claim what they saw. You cannot accept both. There is one does not correlate with the other. You got either you, and his words, you accept the eyes of the fishermen in the Maldives, and you must reject the Inmarsat data. But if you believe the Inmarsat data, then you have to accept that what was seen in the Maldives, and nobody dismisses that they didn't see some aircraft. What aircraft it is, we don't know. And the point I've made to people is, we've got all these eyewitness reports. Ultimately, the Annex 13 team are about MH370, finding it, analysing it, and finding out what on earth happened, and how did this happen, and how to prevent it. They are not there to explain what someone thousands of miles away saw in the air. It's not for the Malaysian government or the Australian government to explain what aircraft the Maldives fishermen saw. That's up to the Maldives authorities to investigate that if they feel it necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One other thing about the Inmarsat data, Mick. I mean, I have a lot of respect for the people at Inmarsat and all the other people that's done the amazing analysis that they've done to come up with the search areas in the southern Indian Ocean. I think that's a remarkable feat that they have done. No disrespect to them. They are experts in their field. But the Inmarsat data, of course, was based on the Air France 447 analysis in that, or the idea to use the Inmarsat data was based on that. Now, there are some differences between Air France 447 and MH370, of course, because Air France 447, you had an aircraft that was in perfectly good condition that experienced a stall. And as far as I know, that ACAR's information from Air France 447 was continuously being transmitted right until the plane crash. And this was in its fullest form, in the sense that there was nothing wrong with the aircraft. The ACAR's messages that they were getting were in its correct form. But in Malaysian 370, after the reboot, the ACAR's messages were not exactly the same as what they were getting prior to when ACAR stopped sending messages. So that would suggest to me that they may have been something mechanical that had happened on the aircraft that stopped the ACARS from sending messages. And when it rebooted again, it wasn't in the same format as when it was when it was sending ACARS messages normally. And I think the flight ID, for example, was missing in the ACARS messages after it rebooted. And that would suggest to me that there might have been some corruption with the data, because it wasn't perfect. If that was the case, if there was corruption in the Inmarsat data, then can we use that data to the extent that Air France 447 used the data to locate the aircraft?
Juanda, we've got about another on my. I'm just looking at the time here. We've got about another 10 more minutes. In that time, I just want to reflect first of all just quickly on the debris. Is there anything that the debris tells us? We know we've got internal debris and external debris. We've got something like 30 plus pieces. I want to stress, when no one is saying every one of those pieces is connected to an aircraft, let alone MH370, but we have made some positive identifications. But just generally on the debris we found, and tremendous work done by Blaine Allen Gibson across the East African coast right down to South Africa, and other people as well, other normal civilians who came forward with what they believe is debris.
Yeah. I think the debris location where it was found indicated that the aircraft did go down in the Indian Ocean, southern Indian Ocean. And I think some of the pieces, the internal pieces, for example, I think there was a fairing from one of the wall panels inside MH370 that matched, or the pattern matched identically to how the furnishings were done in the Malaysian Airlines aircraft.
This what they sort of call it's like a foil pattern on the internal panels, which were specific to Malaysia Airlines 777 aircraft.
Yeah, and also I think the video screen was identical to the type that you'd find in the Malaysian aircraft as well. So if you were able to find internal pieces of the aircraft, then that would suggest that there was a high energy impact when the aircraft went down. And if that was the case, then most likely then the aircraft was not controlled at the time that the aircraft was hitting the water. And also the size of the debris as well. The small pieces of debris would suggest that there was a high energy impact as well.
It's quite small. I think the largest two pieces that have been found and connected are the flaperon and the part of the outboard flap as well. I think that was found in Tanzania. Yeah,
that's right.
And they're the two largest pieces.
Yeah. And if you were to compare that with another case where an aircraft did go down from high altitude, and I'm talking about the Silkair MI185 crash in Indonesia, in Palembang, Indonesia. Now that was a crash from 35,000 feet. And some large parts were actually found from the aircraft as well. And the investigators concluded that those large pieces, I think that came from the tail section of the aircraft, actually came apart as the aircraft descended. And that might explain why you can get large pieces like the flaperon and parts of the flap being found, as well as the smaller pieces of debris that were found caused to high energy impact. So may have those large pieces may have come apart as the aircraft was descending.
That's certainly been, I think, a strong theory that I think even recently Peter Dolan, is it? Yeah, I think Peter Dolan of the ATSB in the Australian Senate committee touched upon as well that this was also something they consider, that we should not make an assumption that those parts came, the flaperon specifically on the flap, that they came off on impact, that there is some line of thought that some of the other smaller parts also suggest rivet popping, and that could also be signs that the aircraft was way outside its operating envelope on descent.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Juanda, just as we move towards a conclusion, just your general thoughts. Specifically, we're both in aviation groups. We're in specific MH370 groups. Your whole Broadway, the media has dealt with this, and then if we could maybe just move to then your final thoughts on this investigation.
There's been lots of different theories out there. Some of them are way out there in that they're just hard to believe. I do get involved in some of these groups, and I'd like to keep an open mind as to what may have happened to MH370. But like you can only go to so far. Yeah, you can.
There's the sublime and there's the absolute ridiculous, and
yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm willing to consider any suggestions and try and reconcile that with what we know, the known facts, for example.
But there's some basic things that really it must be somehow plausible, and too often I see when people want to put a theory, and good luck to them if we want to put theories together. I've always said I don't really have any personal theory myself. The bottom line is I was not on that aircraft. I wasn't flying it. I wasn't there, so I can't. And I'm no satellite expert. I have a general knowledge in multiple areas, but I'm no satellite expert. I'm not a debris analyst. So I can only approach this from a journalistic mind, and pieces have to fit together. You can't just pick and choose, well, I don't understand the Inmarsat data, so I'll just forget that bit. And all I'm interested in is what the eyewitnesses said, or all I'm interested in is just the debris. It doesn't work that way. We've got to be able to fit this together.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what came out recently in the 60 Minutes media about that was very one-sided. I mean, that's my opinion.
It was an appalling program put together. Essentially, it was like a vanity project for somebody who just launched their book. Ironically, it came out days later, so we won't even mention the man's name. But
well, I'm glad you mentioned it because I didn't want to mention it. But that's what it seems like. Yeah. My perspective is
your final thoughts.
Yeah, I've always thought that it was a mechanical problem that they experienced, and they tried to get the plane down on the ground as quick as they could. That was my first thoughts. And there was a recent incident, Mick, that I think you are aware of. I think in the last 3 weeks or so, where I think it was an A320 in China that had a cracked windscreen, and the windscreen cracked to the extent that the first officer was sucked out.
And was this the one where the whole flight management box literally was also blasted out of place?
Yeah, that's right.
Extraordinary catastrophic damage was caused. And you don't understand how that can disable the systems on a plane.
That's right, and even to the extent that the pilots weren't able to communicate because of the wind that was happening inside the cockpit, and also the freezing conditions experienced at that time. So they weren't able to communicate to ATC what had happened, and they just conducted an emergency descent, which was successful. So I tend to think along those lines that might have had a similar occurrence to MH370, and they weren't able to communicate because of the fact that they might have been in a situation where communication wasn't possible.
And as we always say, nobody is suggesting that there could not have been nefarious actions of some kind on this aircraft. We simply don't have enough. We can argue there's some circumstantial evidence together if you want to fit it or interpret it in a certain way, but we have no credible evidence as of yet that a nefarious act took place. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very difficult for us to come to any conclusion as to what has happened to MH370 with the limited information that we have at this stage. All we can do, I guess, is just to continue to analyze the available data that we have, and from there, then hopefully... And possibly hope that the Malaysian government and their Annex 13 team will top to bottom review everything that they have and make available to, even if it's not made public, if it's made available to experts, independent experts, who can also check, recheck, examine it to see, is there something more here that we've missed or we didn't know that can tell us a little bit more. But we need to continue searching on. Absolutely, yeah. And I'm very hopeful that will continue in the next summer. And once we do find a little bit more of the debris, and that will give us a better idea of what may have happened to the aircraft. Then that's when we can start to consider putting together a final report. But I think at this stage it's way too premature. Yeah, no, absolutely, I totally agree there. Juanda Ismail, it has been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for taking the time to join us on Radio Espial. And you're welcome, Mick. We'll keep searching. You take care. Yes. We'll talk soon. Yeah. Okay, Mick. Nice talking to you. See you later. Bye. Take care. Bye. You too. Bye. Okay, that's a wrap for another episode, and I want to thank Juanda Ismail for joining us as a guest. That was a fascinating interview. Just a couple of things I just want to correct. At some stage there, when we were talking to Juanda about the Inmarsat data, Juanda was talking about the burst frequency offset, and I might have inadvertently referred to the burst timing offset, but I just want to emphasize that we were talking about the burst frequency offset. Also, when we talked about the Australian Senate Committee, I mentioned reference to someone called Peter Dolan. I was confusing him with Martin Dolan. It was Peter Foley who I was talking about at the recent Australian Senate meeting. Thank you for joining us. www.radioespial.com. Please give us a follow on Twitter. We're there at Radio Espial on Twitter, and also on Facebook. Give us a like there. Thank you again to Juanda, and take care. We'll see you again soon for episode 11. You never know what guest is coming up next.
You have been listening to Radio Espial, a series of podcasts brought to you across the internet by TIPM Media and presented by investigative journalist Mick Rooney. Please feel free to leave a comment and visit our links provided in this podcast production. Thank you for your support.